Everyone hits a bump in the road. What do you do with it? Be inspired as we explore the ways people experience, navigate, and manage the ups and downs and twists and turns in this road trip called life. Welcome to another episode of Bump in the Road. The basic podcast is always free. We also have a premium subscription called Bump 2 that lets you listen in on extended behind-the-scenes conversations with our guests. Check it out at www.bumpintheroad.us. What happens when your prosperous and orderly corporate life is suddenly ripped out from beneath you? Do you seek a new job, a renewed sense of security? Or is it an opportunity for growth? Bill Eckstrom decided it was the latter, and he used the experience to start an inquiry into what creates growth. What creates stagnation? How do we perceive and react to these situations at home and at work? What's an optimal path for our evolution on both a corporate and personal level? Join Bill and I for a fascinating conversation about comfort, discomfort, and growth. Bill, welcome to Bump in the Road. If you would, tell us your story.
Well, Pat, that's how long do we have on this call? I think probably as it pertains to the spirit of your podcast, my bump in the road, and sometimes I hesitate to tell people because compared to some things that happen to others, tragic things, loss of a child, loss of a family member, my bump in the road seems somewhat minor, but in the moment, it's important. And I think many people can empathize with my bump on the road, and that is getting fired from a job. And that January day in 2008, my world came crashing down. It was easily the most humiliating thing that's ever happened to me. I've had things that are embarrassing, but nothing as humiliating. And I learned a lot. I had to come home and tell my wife. Kids got home from school, had to tell the kids. I had a son about to start college, had two kids younger than that, and it changed a lot of things in my life. But here's the beautiful part of that, Pat. That magical day in 2008 that put me in such a state of chaos is the reason you and I are on the phone or on this podcast together today. So you never know what can happen.
So after you got over the absolute shock of being fired, what happened next?
Oh, you go from that state of chaos and then you try and make sense of it. You try and find an order to it. You try and find some predictability. I had learned obviously a lot as in my former role as the executive senior VP of business development for a publicly traded company. So I had learned a lot in that role. So one of the things I had learned watching is that how, and we all knew this, but shortly before I had lost my job, before I had gotten fired, I had looked for resources to help my leadership team while I was there, to help them understand how to be better coaches. And there was nothing, I could find nothing in the marketplace. So when, after that day, that was certainly the direction I went. I decided, okay, I'm not going to let anybody fire me again. I had other opportunities to do other things similar to what I was doing, working for large corporations again. But I had made the commitment to myself that nobody would ever fire me again because I would never work for anyone else again.
Turning away from that executive lifestyle, though, really has some risks associated with it.
Yes, it does. I leveraged everything I had to get this business started. My wife and I did. So yes, there was a ton of risk associated with it, but the emotion of the risk was less than, created less stress than the emotion of going back to work for another company where I did not control my own destiny. When others control your destiny, that creates me greater stress.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you. But do you think everybody feels that way? Do you think some people like the order of being in a place in a corporation?
They do, but I did too at the time without even knowing it. That I was kind of sucked in to that, and it's not bad. It just wasn't for me. Uh, for people that like the predictability of a paycheck, which I sit there and chuckle because I think how nice that was. People that are okay with not having to make strategic decisions, that that it fits who they are and what they do. I'm happy for them. Just because I did it doesn't make it right for everybody.
So you're not recommending that people go out and quit their jobs?
I'm right. Well, funny part is after this all came out in that TED talk that you and I have talked about, Pat.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, I became somewhat of a poster child for people who had lost their jobs and made it again. And I probably, following the release of my TED talk that went viral, I had probably for a while, for a period of time, certainly initially, did a lot more interviews and podcasts about losing a job and coming back than I did about the concepts within the TED talk.
One of the things you say in your TED Talk that I love is why, I think the title is Why Comfort Will Ruin Your Life,
That is correct. Why comfort will ruin your life.
and what lies behind that.
My story, getting fired, I was so comfortable, which is weird to think that it was very stressful, but yet comfortable because it was so predictable. I knew where my next paycheck was. I knew my bonus was. I knew what stock options were. Um, but it applies to so many things. Being comfortable is really the result of being in a setting or an environment where you understand inputs and outcomes. And I can elaborate on that, but if I know what's happening, both with me or around me, and I know the outcome that produces, that makes it predictable. And predictability is what creates comfort. But comfort is what makes, and we call this environment an ordered environment. But that's what makes it so dangerous, because if I know what's going to happen, I don't want it to change. Um, and that applies to most everything in our lives. For some reason, as human beings, I mean, my goodness, a pandemic hit and everybody went out and started buying paper towels and toilet paper and oat milk, of all things. Oat milk had a 347% increase during the pandemic. Don't ask me how that correlates. But toilet paper, paper towels, things like that, the predictable things, people were just snatching up. There's a visceral need for us to have predictable outcomes. And when that brings that comfort to us, nobody wants to change it. And that keeps us from evolving. It keeps technology companies, when they're making money, it keeps them from innovating. From a business perspective, it keeps our governments from becoming better. It keeps us from learning more about religion and our faith. When we believe something so strongly, we quit investigating it, we quit challenging it, and we don't evolve. And that's scary. That's where comfort can ruin our lives.
I tend to agree. I think the trick is learning to be comfortable with discomfort. Because truly in discomfort, that's where you will grow. But it is, I kind of enjoy it actually. I feel much more alive when I'm in a phase of discomfort. It's creative. The opportunities are really endless. Things can go in so many directions. But I find that most people do really, really tend to avoid it.
They do. So getting back to the science of this, so we know what an ordered environment is all about. Knowing inputs, predictable outcomes. We're comfortable. And another example of that, real quick, before we transition into the discomfort, is an airplane. Why is it? My guess, Pat, you've been on a lot of airplanes before, right?
I'm a pilot.
Okay. So whether you're piloting your own plane at 8,000 feet or you're on a commercial airliner at 37,000 feet, you're comfortable. Why? Pat, you're 8,000 feet in the air. What on earth would make it comfortable? Well, it's
Well, I actually need to give you a little background on this one. I actually used to fly and race high performance sailplanes. So I was flying sometimes at 30,000 feet, actually, uh, in an airplane without an engine. So I learned to be comfortable reading the energy in the sky, essentially, and moving with that energy.
okay. So this is
So a
interesting.
commercial plane looks really safe to me.
Right. Okay. So, but back to the point, whether it's piloting your own or being on a commercial flight, you're far enough up in the air. Anything beyond 30 feet, you're pretty much going to die, right? But the reason people are comfortable doing these things, it's because it leads to a predictable outcome. I know what the outcome's going to be. My pilot's going to land,
Yes.
right? Um, and while no growth occurs in these ordered environments, the environments that bring us comfort, growth does not occur. So back to your point, let's okay, if it doesn't occur there, where does it occur? Growth only occurs in a state of discomfort. That applies psychologically, physiologically, biologically. And the challenge is this: nobody wants to be in a state of discomfort because it's defined this way. If order is understanding inputs and outcomes and having predictability, a complex environment, or what we refer to as complexity in the growth rings, that's explained in the TED Talk and in our book, by the way, the complexity environment is about changing inputs. And when you change an input, that means an outcome will change. And when an outcome changes, if we don't know what that changes, it creates the unknown. And it's unpredictability that creates discomfort. Now, isn't that interesting to think about? It is unpredictability that creates discomfort. I'm doing a keynote on Friday of this week to the Washington State Medical Association. And the theme of their conference, which is basically doctors and administrators in the state of Washington, the theme of their conference is quality improvement. Now think about this for a second, Pat. We have to theme an entire conference. And by the way, I give them credit. I'm not impugning them. But we're going to theme an entire conference around the idea of change, of getting out of your order, of just doing something differently. Why do we need to do that? What is it? That's my point. It's such a human problem, human challenge, and human need in us all to be in those states of order where we have predictability. And it happened when you and I got on the call today, right? Do you have a headset?
Very true.
Right?
That's right. We switched things up a little bit.
Right. I mean, so we all have those, whether we know it or not. It comes out in our behaviors throughout the day, but it also, there's an order, sadly, sometimes to the way we think about people. I know who you are, and so therefore I'm going to treat you the same way, so I get the same outcome when I'm around you. Well, guess what? Maybe we don't know those people.
I find it interesting that a group that's looking at quality assurance, which is really a repetitive type of endeavor where you want to repeat the same outcome again and again and again, is looking at the impact of change on that type of system.
So yeah, right. So it's really dichotomous, isn't it?
Yeah.
When you think about the medical field, because they have things like evidence-based medicine, where we are going to require doctors to follow this series of best practices because we know when you do that, we get a better result at the end. But think of it this way. Let's get back to your flying. If you knew there's a better and safer way for those pilots to fly that airplane, wouldn't you want them to do it?
Absolutely.
And by the way, wouldn't you want the FAA to continually look at ways to improve the quality assurances of aircraft, of their pilots flying those aircraft? So while given the current evidence, here's how we should do things. But if that's where we stop, that's when we hit a place of order. And when we hit order, we can go into stagnation. Everything can go backwards. So while we'll follow best practice, we'll follow those evidence, we'll follow the science. That's today. But later today, we better be thinking about how that can evolve tomorrow.
How do you integrate that into a corporate structure?
Wow, that's a really good question, Pat. There are organizations that literally have departments that that I can't say departments, but they're people within different departments that meet regularly to have these strategic, thought-provoking meetings. Uh, it takes leaders who understand what I just explained to continually challenge the way they do things and not be afraid to lead through change. And that's one of the things that I think is the biggest challenge for leaders is the second there's pushback, the second there's, oh, this isn't working, or the second there's, well, this is painful. You know, a lot of our work, as a matter of fact, as a company at the Excel Institute, revolves around helping leaders understand what they do well and what they don't do well. We call it coaching, how well they coach. And when they get a report back that says, hey, on a scale of 1 to 100, I'm only a 68, all of a sudden they don't like our work, in spite of the fact it's accurate, right? And does the senior leader, does that senior coach have the skills and the talents to lead through those tough times when people are pushing back? So it,
And the security, because in a structure like that, your security often rests on your boss and how comfortable they are.
you're right. Some bosses that I've been exposed to, have worked with, invoke chaos. They don't even create that complex environment, that whole discomfort. They go straight to chaos at times, and that makes people unsure. That's not a healthy environment. Fear is another way you can create discomfort, but again, that's not healthy.
Now, if you would backtrack just a little bit for our listeners and talk about these successive rings of chaos, complexity, order, um, and stagnation, so they understand kind of what lies behind your conversation.
Uh, it's kind of like thinking of the Olympic rings and turning them on their on their end. They're four rings that are just interlinked. Is the way, and if I can graphically describe it, that's how it looks. Uh, and within those rings are environments. And when I say environments, I'm talking about our perceived surroundings that shape living things. And stagnation, for example, is an environment. Stagnation creates negative growth, and we call these the growth rings. So what is their impact on growth, both to us as people, as environment? It could be a living thing, could be a sports team, your family, Pat. A living thing could be a community, or certainly your place at work. It could be a forest. So how do these environments affect living things? Stagnation creates negative growth. Well, what creates stagnation? It can be a state of mind. Stagnation could be forced upon us, a pandemic. Look what the pandemic has done to the hospitality industry. It's created a state of stagnation, right? It's taken back negative growth. So stagnation is not a healthy environment to be. The opposite end of stagnation is chaos. Chaos is having no understanding or control of what's coming in or what's going out, inputs or outcomes. Natural disasters create chaos. Chaos typically is, you're there when you feel one of the three F's, and I say F's: fight, flight, or freeze. And those are all feels. When you feel one of those, you're probably in a state of chaos. In a business setting, we'll see chaos occur, mergers and acquisitions. A company takes us over or buys us, and I don't know what my new job is. I don't even know if I have a job. I don't know who I report to. And we see that occur a lot, and people just kind of go to work and they freeze. They don't do much. The pandemic, getting back to that, created a lot of chaos for our company, for me personally. When the pandemic hits and we have clients calling saying, hey, we can't pay, and we need to break our contract, and you don't know what you're going to do. When, overnight, 3 out of the 4 lines of our business were literally wiped out. And so I never forgot to call her president up. I just said, hey, what are we going to do? And she said, I don't know. What do you think? I said, I don't know. Well, I'm just going to think about it. So we did nothing for a while, and we just kind of soaked it in, So that's a state of chaos. Coming then back down the growth rings. The second circle up would be described as order, and order is what we talked about. Having predictable inputs and predictable outcomes. And when I have predictable outcomes, it creates comfort. Order is where we want to be. There's an order to the way we get up in the morning, right? If I get up at this time and I, do these things, I can get out the door at this time. I can be in my office at this time and get kids to school at this time. Everything's about predictability. And order's not necessarily all bad or evil. It's just that nothing grows there. And there's a pilot example, right? But here's where order can really get you. I used to fly a lot pre-pandemic, as you can imagine. And you'll get a kick out of this story, Pat, especially knowing your background. My wife sat down with me one day at the dinner table, and this is years ago, and she said, hey, I've been reading about this new thing called TSA PreCheck. And I said, okay, tell me more. She said, well, it has to do with navigating airports. You can go through security faster, but you have to go through an approval process. You got to pay a fee. You got to go to the TSA office up in Omaha, Nebraska, and get approved. They do background checks and so forth. And you can probably empathize. I had flown so much. My order was so strong. I always arrived at my destination on time with my laptop, with my charging cables, with my phone. I never left anything behind because I followed this process that led to a predictable outcome. If I did the same inputs, I got the same outcome. So she says, hey, here's a better way. And my response was viscerally, no, I'm not going to do that. Don't mess with what I have going. Flying's stressful enough anyway, but man, I got it down to a system and a science, and don't mess with my system or science. Well, now you know the rest of the story, right? Several months later, I'm late for a flight. I get into the airport, and the line at security, I feel like I'm at Disney World. And I remember thinking, oh, wow, I've never missed a flight in my life, but I'm probably going to miss this one. And I got to the end, and as I'm standing in line, I turn to my left, and there's this woman who works there, TSA stuff on her uniform. And she's right by this little line of like 5 people just going right through into security. And I turned to her, I said, ma'am, excuse me, but what's that line there? And she said, oh, that's our new TSA PreCheck line. So my order that produced a predictable outcome, it just turned into stagnation. My way was no longer the best way, but because I was so comfortable with the outcome I was getting, I refused to evolve. So when you evolve, you enter that fourth ring, which is what we call complexity. And complexity is changed inputs, and that leads to unknown outcomes. And unknown is what makes us uncomfortable. But if it applies to psychologically how we live, we don't want to make, and the example I gave is a great example, but it prevents us from evolving at work. I mean, think no further than compact computers, Kodak, Blockbuster. Our company right now would be dead without our very fast evolution. But it's really a challenging part to tell people that you have to become comfortable with discomfort in order to continually evolve. And that's the magic.
Thank you for joining us today. I hope you found something in today's podcast that inspires you along your own life's path, because sometimes a bump in the road is actually a portal into a more conscious and meaningful life. You can subscribe to our free podcast at www.bumpintheroad.us or become a premium member to hear the full conversation. Just go to www.bumpintheroad.us for more information and to sign up.